When David Thompson first saw the apartment on Maple Street, it was a wreck. The once grand building had fallen into disrepair, its ornate facade marred by years of neglect. But David, a skilled carpenter and general contractor, saw potential beneath the grime and decay. He envisioned the dilapidated space transformed into a stunning, modern apartment, a place he could call home. David had always been drawn to projects like this. He loved the challenge of taking something old and making it new again. As he signed the lease and got the keys, he felt a rush of excitement. This place was going to be his masterpiece. The first few days of the renovation went smoothly. David tore out old carpeting, ripped down faded wallpaper, and started to rewire the outdated electrical system. It was hard work, but he enjoyed it. He worked long hours, often staying late into the night, the sound of his tools echoing through the empty building. One evening, as he was prying up the floorboards in the living room, he found something strange. Beneath the old, rotting wood was a small, sealed box. Intrigued, David carefully pried it open. Inside was a collection of yellowed papers, old photographs, and a worn leather-bound journal. Curiosity getting the better of him, David sat down and began to leaf through the journal. The entries were written in a neat, looping script and dated back to the 1920s. The author, a man named Edward Sinclair, had lived in the apartment with his wife, Margaret. As David read, he felt a growing unease. Edward's journal detailed a series of disturbing events that had occurred in the apartment. Edward wrote of strange noises in the night, shadows moving on their own, and a feeling of being watched. He described finding strange symbols carved into the walls and floors, symbols that neither he nor Margaret could explain. The journal entries became increasingly frantic as Edward detailed the deterioration of his wife's mental state. She became paranoid, convinced that something malevolent was lurking in the apartment, watching them. One of the last entries sent a chill down David's spine. Edward wrote about a creature, black as night, with glowing red eyes, that he had seen in the apartment. He described it as a shadow-given form, a dark presence that seemed to move with purpose and malice. Edward claimed that the creature had attacked Margaret, driving her to the brink of madness. David closed the journal, his hands shaking slightly. He took a deep breath and tried to shake off the unease that had settled over him. It was just an old story, he told himself. There was no such thing as ghosts or monsters. He was a man of logic and reason, and he wasn't about to let an old journal scare him. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As he continued his work, he found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at him. The apartment, once a place of promise and potential, now felt oppressive and dark. A few nights later, David was working late, sanding down a set of newly installed cabinets. The apartment was silent, save for the rhythmic sound of the sander. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. David cursed under his breath and grabbed a flashlight from his toolbox. As he clicked the flashlight on, its beam cutting through the darkness, he saw it. In the corner of the room, a shadow darker than the rest, shifting and moving. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its eyes glowed a malevolent red. David took a step back, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The creature from Edward's journal, it was real. The shadowy figure moved closer, its form shifting and undulating as if made of smoke. David's breath caught in his throat as he felt a cold, oppressive presence wash over him. Without thinking, David turned and ran. He bolted out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street. He didn't stop running until he was several blocks away, his lungs burning and his heart pounding. He leaned against a lamppost, trying to catch his breath and make sense of what he had just seen. David knew he couldn't abandon the apartment. It was his project, his dream. But he also knew he couldn't face that creature alone. He needed help. The next morning, David visited the local library. He spent hours poring over old newspapers and historical records, trying to find any information about Edward Sinclair and the history of the apartment building. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. In the 1920s, there had been a series of mysterious deaths and disappearances in the building. Several residents had reported seeing strange shadows and hearing unexplained noises. The police had investigated but found no evidence of foul play. The incidents were eventually written off as accidents or suicides. David also found references to a local legend about a creature known as the Shadow Man. According to the legend, the Shadow Man was a malevolent spirit that could take on a physical form. It was said to be drawn to places of great suffering and could drive its victims to madness or death. Armed with this new knowledge, David returned to the apartment. He was scared, but he was also determined. He couldn't let the Shadow Man drive him away from his dream. He decided to confront the creature and find a way to banish it for good. That night, David set up a series of cameras and audio recorders around the apartment. He wanted to document any paranormal activity and gather evidence of the Shadow Man's existence. He also brought in a few protective talismans and a book of old rituals he had found at the library. As he waited in the darkened apartment, David felt a growing sense of dread. The air was thick with tension, and every creak and groan of the building set his nerves on edge. He sat in the living room, the journal open on his lap, reading through Edward's final entries once more. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a cold, oppressive presence filled the room. David looked up and saw the Shadow Man standing in the doorway. Its form was more defined now, a dark silhouette with glowing red eyes. David stood up, holding the book of rituals in one hand and a talisman in the other. He began to recite the words he had memorized, his voice shaking but determined. The Shadow Man hissed, its form shifting and writhing as if in pain. As David continued the ritual, the creature let out a piercing scream. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, and David felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He forced himself to keep going, focusing on the words and the talisman in his hand. The room seemed to vibrate with energy as the ritual reached its climax. The Shadow Man's form began to dissolve, its edges fraying and breaking apart. With one final, anguished cry, the creature vanished, leaving the room eerily silent. David collapsed to his knees, exhausted but triumphant. He had done it. He had banished the Shadow Man. The oppressive presence that had haunted the apartment was gone, and the air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. In the days that followed, David continued his renovation with a renewed sense of purpose. The apartment no longer felt dark and foreboding. It was just an old building in need of some love and care. He finished the work, transforming the space into a beautiful, modern home. David moved in and lived there for many years, always remembering the encounter with the Shadow Man. He never spoke of it to anyone, keeping the journal and the book of rituals locked away in a drawer. But every now and then, when the lights flickered or a shadow moved just a little too quickly, he would feel a twinge of unease and remember that night. Years later, after David had moved out, the apartment was rented to a young couple, Sarah and Michael. They were excited to start their new life together in the beautifully renovated space. The landlord, an elderly man who had inherited the building, didn't mention the apartment's dark history. He figured it was best left in the past. Sarah and Michael settled in quickly, loving the apartment's charm and character. But it wasn't long before strange things began to happen. They heard footsteps in the hallway at night, even though they were alone. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and they often felt a cold, oppressive presence. One night, Sarah found the old journal hidden in the back of a closet. She showed it to Michael, and they began to read through it together. The entries sent chills down their spines, and they realized that the apartment had a dark and terrifying history. As they read Edward's final entries, the temperature in the room dropped and the lights flickered. A cold, dark presence filled the apartment, and they saw the Shadow Man standing in the corner. Its red eyes glowed with malevolent intent, and it began to move toward them. Terrified, Sarah and Michael ran from the apartment, leaving everything behind. They never returned, and the apartment remained vacant for many years. The legend of the Shadow Man continued to haunt the building, a dark presence that refused to be banished.